Your Holiness and Beatitude, esteemed guests, dear friends, I don't know if I have ever faced more difficulty with preparation for any other speech like I did with this one. How do you condense in a few minutes a joyous obligation of the host to tell such educated guests about where they are, and how do you put it in the world context? And when describing the terror that your country has gone through, how do you keep a cheerful and a positive spirit? Where do you draw the line between the academic presentation and an event-specific concerned narrative? How do you denounce without offending? How do you tell the harsh truth to the friends and partners without turning them into the enemies? Whom do you address? Your beloved compatriots, your dear guests, or someone not sitting in this hall but listening very carefully to this Congress? So, my dear Patriarch and our dear audience, do mercy me in your judgment of this extremely complicated speech. As a host, I'm obliged to brief our foreign guests on modern Georgia, its hardships and joys, its threats and dreams. Without this, it would be impossible to put in the context the status of family issues and demographic condition of our country. Perhaps the foreign part of the audience will see many parallels with their own countries, draw relevant conclusions for their own reality. Our ancient country, one of the oldest Christian nations in the world, a proud owner of a rare, authentic language, culture, alphabet, and polyphony, one of the most indigenous ethnoses on the planet, which scientists believe has lived here for at least 6,000 years, is yet again torn in the battle of the superpowers. Perhaps not without the fault of our own mistakes, we host you in the hard times for our nation. But as you will see during your visit, no hardship prevents us, Georgians, or Kartveli, as we call ourselves, from being happy, hospitable, and respectful towards our guests. We Georgians believe that when God gave lands to the nations, we were late for the handout as always. When last with him, we asked God to forgive us for being late because we were hosting guests. And we asked him to nonetheless give us a land to live in too. The forgiving Father gave us the last piece of earth, which he had actually saved for himself. This is how we got to live in this majestic paradise called Sakartvelo. And this is why all the superpowers at all times have wanted to own us, and our history is nothing but trying to stay Kartveli in the face of a supreme force, each one arrogant, promising us the liberation from the previous force, promising us its permanent dominance of values. This era is not our first era of survival. Modern Western Empire, battling Russian Empire over Georgia, are not at all new to us. Over thousands of years, antique Ellada versus Parthia, Mazdaeanic Persia versus Greece, Shiite Iran versus Byzantine Empire, Arab Khalifas versus the Mongol Khans, Ottomans versus the Tsars, communists versus the capitalists have battled each other over Sakartvelo. This year we celebrate a quarter of a century of restoring of Georgia's ancient state and its independence from communism. Perhaps it is important to stress that Georgia's longing for restoring of its statehood was never Russophobic. Together with Russians, we have endured and got rid and defeated first the fascism and then the communism, and both coming to us from the West. And although before that Christian Russia helped Christian Georgia in its existential struggle against extermination, it did so at an unacceptable for us cost of abolishing of our kingdom and of our church independence. And hence our desire to restore Georgian independence was always unshakable, rooted in the profound understanding that a nation of our depth of culture and history could never be fully healthy and could never realize its full potential as a part of another country. Generations of our heroes have fought and sacrificed their lives for this holy cause. our generation was honored to be the last one. And as undoubtedly the terror and hardships that befell upon our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were infinitely greater than those upon us, we too had to defend our share of Sakartvelo. 27 years ago, on April the 9th, 1989, a few hundred meters from here, Soviet soldiers crushed a peaceful pro-independence demonstration on the country's main Rustaveli Avenue. Civilians were killed with sharpened shovels, bullets, chemical gas, heavy clubs. 19 have died, 16 of them were women, hundreds were wounded. The world was shocked by the news, but soon forgot about them as the tragic events of Beijing's Tiananmen Square overshadowed the tragedy of Tbilisi. Many of us were hoping that this bloody tragedy was a conclusion in the long quest for the soon-to-be-gained independence, but little did we know that it was actually a prelude to many more tragedies and hardships to follow. Civil wars, occupation of our two regions of Abkhazia and Tskhinvali, temporary loss of over 20% of our territory, every eighth person ethnically cleansed and turned refugee from those regions, and then the Western-sponsored so-called Rose Revolution in 2003, resulting in even more terror for our population. When the independence-minded Georgia looked towards the West with hope, it considered the Western culture as a beacon of freedom for its citizens, their speech, their religion, and the private enterprise. And what a disappointment this has been so far. Instead of the freedom for our citizens, we got the Western-sponsored regime of Rose Revolution of 2003, which during the 9 years of its rule has jailed over 330,000 people, giving them a staggering 0.1 official acquittal rate from its courts. For a country of our size, this means that 7.5% of our entire population was recently jailed. It means that 10% of ethnic Georgians went to prison under the rule of the revolutionary regime. It means that 35% of working-age Georgian males were put to jail by Mr. Saakashvili and his henchmen. At some point, when the number of simultaneous prisoners in jails jumped from some 10,000 to 31,000, in terms of the percentage of the population in jail, Georgia moved from number 50 or so in the world to number 2 in the world, right next to the world leader, the United States. You want us to talk about the family situation in Georgia? I just did. Almost no family was left untouched by this. Instead of the freedom of enterprise, by the official statistics of Georgia's prosecutor's office, we got 9,940 businesses harassed, oppressed, and/or confiscated by the Saakashvili regime. The owners being massively arrested and jailed, losing their shares, their buildings, their land, their cash, their automobiles, and only being released after the payment of an official ransom and after the signing over of their property, either to the state or its favorite oligarchs. You want us to talk about the family situation in Georgia? I just did. Almost no businessman's family was left untouched by this. Instead of the freedom of religion, we got constant, relentless humiliation and attacks on our embattled Georgian Orthodox Christian Church, its patriarch, its clergy, its preaching, its followers. The attacks planned and perpetrated by the hundreds of non-governmental organizations established and lavishly funded by the West in our poor country, propagating, employing, and poisoning a part of our young generation who, in the absence of employment and education alternatives, and in exchange for the 30 silver, are bred in the spirit of anti-traditional cynicism and a false promise of an illusional freedom. You want us to talk about the family situation in Georgia? I just did. No Christian family was left unhumiliated by this system. And instead of the freedom of speech, we got a totalitarian dictatorship of liberals on our television and in our press, and increasingly so in our educational institutions and bodies. Liberals whose main goal seems to be multiplying their own kind in the ranks with a clan-like discrimination of others, exhibiting on a non-stop basis shamelessness and perversion, and ruthlessly crushing, mocking, demonizing, and ignoring the voice of traditional Georgian society. You want us to talk about the family situation in Georgia? I just did. No family, no viewer, adult or a child in Georgia has been left untouched by this. Despite the terror of the Rose Revolution and its full support from the West, our people opposed the rule with peaceful democratic means. This is what the revolutionary forces did to them on November 7th, 2007. Look at these pictures, please. And this is what they did to them on May 26, 2011, on the same Rustaveli Avenue. This was no longer the Red Army. This was the Western-sponsored Georgian liberalism. After this last bloodbath, the next morning Saakashvili hosted a military parade, having washed the streets from the blood, while 2 corpses of the civilian victims of the massacre were still hidden by the police on the rooftop of a nearby building. Every Western ambassador standing next to him, not a single word of protest. 2 years later, the West has supported another yet attempt for the propaganda of anti-traditional values, and when our society opposed this attempt, chased the shameless propagandists from the site without hurting them, thank God, the same cohort of Western ambassadors sang in a choir of outrage over us not accepting the shame parade. What conclusions can our society draw from this non-diplomatic offense? When Georgians are mutilated and killed by the Western-sponsored political regime, they support a victory parade the next day. When Georgians dare raise their voice against an attempt to impose upon us a shameful set of pseudo-values, the West is outraged. Despite this, the Georgians continued their struggle against the bloody regime, and despite its fierce resistance and full support from the West, we were able to change this regime through democratic elections in 2012. Nobody expected this to be possible, and God only knows what would happen if it wasn't for these gruesome videos of prisoner raping and beatings, which were made public ahead of the election, and as a result, made the planned Western-sponsored falsification of the parliamentary election results impossible. The newly elected government has prosecuted Saakashvili, who fled to the United States. But instead of handing him to our authorities, his sponsors have deployed him to orchestrate another revolution, now as a governor of the war-torn, poor Ukraine. To do this, he, as the ex-Georgian president, had to refuse his citizenship and accept the Ukrainian one, an unprecedented case in the international politics. Whenever left alone by the West and its NGOs, the new government does some good things in the meantime. As an apolitical citizen, I am obliged and happy to be objective and to admit its successes too. Aside from stopping the terror on the population and business, which is a priceless achievement for this nation, the new government has implemented a very successful healthcare reform for all citizens, raised our farming and agriculture from its grave through numerous support initiatives, introduced impressive tax and funding reforms for the business and industry, reduced drastically the high-level corruption that completely embodied Saakashvili's high ranks. But unfortunately, this is not enough. Our country is still profoundly shocked over the horrors of the previous decade. A virtual absence of any justice restoration is preventing this cheerful nation from optimism. The majority of the population is depressed and cynical. Then we were taught by the West the new term, cohabitation, which had marked an effective prohibition for the newly elected parliament and government of the sovereign state to prosecute the previous political regime. As a result, the new government has been able to justly prosecute only a handful of the previous regime criminals, in each case facing a fierce resistance and PR attacks from the West. Hardly any businessman or oppressed citizen has been rehabilitated since then, and the new government has been held hostage to the everlasting threat of a Ukrainian-like military coup and the return of Ukraine-stationed Saakashvili and his gang if the new government did not obey the Western ideology. And obey they did. Under this threat, the new parliament and government has been passing laws and regulations that even the previous regime did not dare to pass. Our exhausted and depleted electorate, grateful to the new political force for this salvation, has been left confused and awed at what had followed this victory. Here are a few examples. The new parliament has adopted one of the most radical versions of the so-called Anti-Discrimination Law in a North Korean-style unanimous vote. If in most of its Western prototypes, this law covers mostly employment regulations, here the law is omnipresent. Under its provisions, any citizen can go to jail or have his/her business liquidated if the judge believes the victim has been, quote, discriminated. The Ministry of Education has accelerated introduction of gender theory-based sexual education school subjects, poorly masking their initial additions and retreating temporarily under the reaction of our society, but never revising the course. The Parliament developed a new barbarian version of the Juvenile Justice Law, which is about to be ratified, which will give social workers the increased rights to separate children from their parents under the excuse of abstract formulations, such as, quote, failing to meet the child's physical and psychological needs, which are obviously subject to individual interpretation, and again hold the society hostage to the mercy of judgment of low-paid social workers and put family culture under further pressure. The same Parliament has rejected all attempts to ban or limit an omnipresent advertising and propaganda of the online and offline gambling and casinos, which drives thousands of Georgian families into poverty, drama, and tragedy. We were unable to make hardly any progress at all towards controlling the tragic scales of abortions in Georgia. To compare, in Poland, which is much more European than Georgia, with 40 million population, annually only 1,000 abortions are made, and Polish senators and government are fighting even this number, whereas in Georgia, with 3.8 million population, some 40 to 100,000 abortions are made annually, and nobody is fighting this in our parliament. The mainstream Georgian television has been filled with perverts and cynics, even more than during the rule of the previous regime. Numerous other initiatives, unclear in their harmfulness to regular citizens, but so painfully familiar for this educated audience, have been launched in a meteor-like shower of legal and policy initiatives upon our socio-political reality. Here are some examples. Number one, ongoing attempts to decriminalize the so-called light impact narcotics. Number two, legal bans on young marriages, even in the case of parental consent, while simultaneously promoting promiscuity and perversion among the teenagers in the environment of unlimited pornographic access. Number three, states' funding of cesarean sections, resulting in abnormally high percentages of those in our hospitals because some consciousness-free doctors prefer to make it easy for themselves and make more money on those operations, and they don't care if they artificially handicap women's fertility rate. And other numerous initiatives of this sort are our daily life now. As a result, we are dying. 50 or so thousand more people die every year in Georgia than are born. 40 to 100,000 abortions, as I told you, are made in Georgia annually, mostly among ethnic Georgians. While doing this, thanks to liberal propaganda, people are under the illusion that this is due to their economic hardships, not realizing what we all know in this room: the richer the country, the less children its families bear. And if this was not indeed the case, then why would the other ethnic groups in Georgia, may they all live long and prosper with us, be multiplying under the same or worse economic conditions, living in the same country with us? As a result, in accordance with the forecast of the UN, by 2050, our country's population will reduce by 28%, primarily at the cost of ethnic Georgians, whose quantity will be halved in the same period. Our beautiful ancient nation is currently dying in a defunct, hellishly urbanized environment in front of idiotic TV shows, while singing and dancing along to this death through thousands of casinos, nightclubs, and bars. In all our attempts to seek justice from the West, which stubbornly continues to shelter and promote aggressive liberalism in Georgia, we are basically told that those 330,000 people deserve to be jailed. Those 10,000 businessmen were crooks. Our church deserved to be attacked because it opposes freedom, and our people need to be taught democracy. Hence, without any exaggeration, we can state, instead of freedom expected from the West, we got jail, terror, perversion, and injustice. As a result, the Western idol in Georgia has fallen, no matter what our current politicians and mainstream media tell you. The nation has already drawn its conclusions from the Western policy in Georgia, and its image has unfortunately been completely tarnished in our country. I say this with great disappointment as one of the first Georgians to be sent to the West for education during Gorbachev's perestroika. Healthy sides of the respected Western culture, which we still need to adopt and instill in Georgia, have been unfortunately completely overshadowed by the above nonsense. Every time someone raises the voice against the above Western policy, he or she is immediately accused of being a Kremlin spy by the Western-sponsored liberal politicians, media, and NGOs. As a result, the West has already de facto lost Georgia when it attacked our traditional society, its roots, and its cultural fabric. As the official West continues to show no remorse over its actions in Georgia, its remaining influence hinges upon its so-called support of the territorial integrity of Georgia against Russian occupation. The day Kremlin realizes this and leads reconciliation between Tbilisi and Sukhumi and Tbilisi and Tskhinvali will be the day the West loses Georgia completely. I say this too with honest regret, as I believe Georgia can only be truly independent in a balanced and a profound friendship with both superpowers. Our main goal is reuniting Georgia, returning Abkhazia and Tskhinvali to Georgia, and bringing our refugees back to their homes, inhabiting entire Georgia with happy, strong families of all people living alongside with Georgians for centuries, irrespective of their nationality or religion. Everything else is a possible tool for achieving this goal. Hence, as a protagonist of independent Georgia, peaceful and reunited, friendly with Russia and the West, the family and tradition-centered Georgia, the only Georgia that can be, let me address from this podium our Western partners. And let me do this not as their enemy, but as their friend and critic, their disappointed critic. Number one, stop this madness now. Number two, do not interfere with the internal affairs of this sovereign state. Number three, cease financing of permanent attacks on our church and family through hundreds of your sponsored NGOs. Number four, apologize for Joe Biden's, Hillary Clinton's, and Barack Obama's statements that national traditions no longer matter and that the U.S.'s main foreign policy priority is supporting homosexuality worldwide. Number five, stop this cultural war on the rest of the world, or you will lose not only Georgia and the rest of the world, but your own countries too. Your first president, George Washington, ruled at the same time as our last great king, Irakli II. Thousands of years before that, the parents of Europe, our Greek brothers, considered stealing wisdom from Georgia as the greatest act of heroism. Jason and the Argonauts went to Georgia to kidnap Golden Fleece and Medea's medicine. Rvino is a Georgian word which later became vino for the rest of the world. Wheat varieties come from Georgian Khorbali. Metallurgy was born here. And yes, we admire you for your short-lived 200-year-long success, current success. And as an eternal nation, we want to learn from you the healthy sides of your culture, like we have learned from much greater cultures than yours. But trust us, we are seeing clear signs of rotting on your body, like we have seen on many others who have come and gone from here. And trust us, you are unconvincing when you think you can teach us morals, some newly invented pseudo-universal values, and the ways how to be with our women and children. And if friendship is not an empty word for you, do learn these things from us, since you have clearly forgotten them. Learn them from us like we want to learn from you how to lay better asphalt on our roads. Make this friendship of ours a two-way street, and you will be forgiven. Continue trying to occupy us with your trained monkeys and spies, and you will continue being unsuccessful. Try to scare us, and you will be disappointed. Instead, try from the clean start to be our friend. Help us transform Georgia from being a battlefield between you and Russia, which it currently is, into a rare oasis of your peaceful and cultural dialogue with it. And please remember, Georgia is family, and never ever touch it again with anything but respect. Thank you very much.